All right. So for tonight's study hall, share your session. Of course, I started recording, so I forgot how to speak for a moment. We have a guest joining us. This is Justin Wood. So just for anyone who hasn't made it to one of these before, when we have a guest in, usually we start just by checking in a little bit about who they are, how they got here. They might talk a little bit about how they do their session kind of work. And then we can ask questions about how we might integrate this information into some of the things that we all do as practitioners. So, just to introduce quickly, Justin owns the company Genetics, and that's ticks with a ks.ca if you're checking out the website. And what they do there is testing. So they do lab tests for, correct me if I get this wrong, but like the 15 most common important pathogens that we see in tick-borne illnesses in Canada. And then he's also involved in research projects with the University of Guelph, kind of looking at what happens when those pathogens meet a human host. And a lot of us I know work with people with Lyme, with alpha-gal. And so that was the conversation that the two of us had started having about how we are working with these things as holistic practitioners. And I know most of us are probably interested in what new research is out there. So, Justin, I would love it if you wanted to tell everybody for a moment just about your story and how you got interested in this and
Yeah,
started this project.
definitely. Yeah. Sometimes I can be a little bit long-winded trying to tell this story because it has a lot of different parts to it. So I'll try and keep it reasonably concise. But I got into working with Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases the same way that almost everybody that works with Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases does. And that was through my personal experience with them. So almost everybody I've found that works in this field has either had an interaction with like these diseases themselves or somebody really close to them has as well. So it's a field that I think is really like it can be quite polarized in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of people that are like really deeply rooted in what they do here through compassion and personal experiences. So in sort of keeping with that, I had my own really quite severe battle with Lyme disease. Started when I was probably in my early mid 20s. And I would say it didn't really come to an end. I don't think that a lot of battles with Lyme disease really come to an end, but it came to a place where I feel very comfortable kind of continuing my life in what feels like a very fulfilling way to me, maybe in the last like 4 or 5 years. So I had a long period of time where I wasn't really able to function in a normal society. I was very, very sick from probably, I'd say like 2012, 2013, all the way through 2018 in that period. Going into that, I should maybe back up a little bit. I was at the University of Calgary doing my master's degree in a field called functional genomics. I was like a university athlete. I was playing varsity soccer. I was spending all my weekends in the mountains, mountain biking, snowboarding in the winter, and it all kind of came to a pretty grinding halt. I kind of barely squeaked through finishing my master's, took a little bit of time off, was accepted to a PhD program in neuroscience, and then life just came all sort of crashing down in what felt like almost overnight. So I went from kind of participating in all of those things to not being able to walk. I couldn't read. I couldn't use a computer. I couldn't listen to music. I couldn't really be in a room with more than one person at a time. No bright lights, no sound. I couldn't really socialize. And a lot of like really just overwhelming sensory issues, a lot of chronic pain, very severe chronic pain, just kind of life to a grinding halt for probably, I would say, 2 years at least before I got any sort of diagnosis. So already I'd kind of identified that there's a huge issue in Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases around diagnosing. Something that's improved marginally in the last 10 years, but still it's nowhere near where it needs to be. Once I did get a diagnosis, it was then a battle to get treatment. Particularly in North America, we don't have a great grasp on um, really accepting these sorts of diagnoses and then following through with effective treatment protocols. So a lot of people, myself included, we strayed away from what I would probably consider the like strict Western medicine model and found a lot of healing in, again, what some people might consider like alternative modalities. Um, So I had my own experiences with sort of moving through a change in my perception of medicine versus healing, and sort of just a big shift from somebody coming from a very strict science background into accepting and really advocating for different types of treatment modalities. And I think that's where Alexis and I's conversation kind of came together a little bit. And I was really interested in the work that she does because I'd had some experiences myself with that sort of work and found a lot of relief in areas that, again, would be termed by a lot of people, I think, as alternative modalities. Though I think they have a very important place in Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. And you'll find that a large percentage of the community of people that actually get better do it by pursuing these avenues. I don't know a lot of people in my personal experience that have gone from being very, very sick to recovered or in remission without moving through these sorts of modalities as well. So I'm a big sort of proponent for that. And then, yeah, so by the time I actually got a diagnosis, I had a really difficult treatment path because if you sort of don't diagnose Lyme disease early, people become very sick and the treatment becomes very severe. So it's not sort of your standard, oh, I'll take 4 weeks of antibiotics and I'll be better. It's a very complicated path to recovery and it can be very, very painful as well. The treatments are often sort of likened to sort of chemotherapies where they have really, really detrimental effects on the person that's being treated. It can be very severe. It can be worse than the illness itself sometimes. And the success rates can be reasonably low as well for people. So I probably had about 2 or 3 years after that of treatment before I started to find something that worked for me. From there, I started to get better. And as soon as I got better, I'd sort of missed a big chunk of my life. And I thought, okay, how can I try and jump back into this field? And how can I contribute in a way that feels meaningful to me? What's a good starting point for that? And sort of along this way, I had met a lot of practitioners in Canada, a lot of researchers, and had identified this sort of niche that if somebody had, been bit by a tick, there was no way for them to take that tick and say, hey, does this tick carry tick-borne pathogens that could then make me sick? Which to me seemed like a really obvious thing that I would want to do if I was bit by a tick again. So I kind of identified that as a maybe like an entry point into the world of Lyme disease, research and advocacy in Canada. And I started that company in 2018. And then from there, as that grew, started looking at other ways to contribute and joined a research lab at the University of Guelph, which, as Alexis said, was or is sort of more focused on what happens when pathogen meets host, rather than at the company we look at what happens with pathogens in the ticks. And so that's kind of created a possibility to look at the whole sort of breadth of what happens from pathogen in tick transmission to host, what host factors, influence how sick somebody gets. There's a whole world of, interactions that are not well explored in Lyme disease that we kind of aim to learn more about, as well as our one of our main goals in the project that I work on the most is how can we develop a diagnostic for humans which actually works, because currently the diagnostics are, at least the laboratory diagnostics are quite poor. The standard is something called two-tier serology, which is basically two tests that have to be positive in succession to say somebody has Lyme disease. And unfortunately, both of them are probably too stringent to work. So they miss probably about 50% of people that actually have Lyme disease. So this leaves a whole host of people like me that fall into a category of the medical system says, no, you don't have Lyme disease, you're fine. You get sicker and sicker until, in some cases for people, there's nothing that can really be done for them. Other people suffer so much that they, find ways to end their suffering. And it just creates this situation that, in my opinion, is completely inappropriate for where the medical system should be around a disease that's been around for, since the early 80s at the very least. So um, one of our big projects that we're working on is can we create something that can tell you actively if somebody has Lyme disease, if they're suffering from it, how sick they are, and that sort of thing. So that's a not so brief history of who I am and how I got here. But like I said, I think it's a bit of nuance in there, and it's I try not to skip over too many details, but that might lead to the inclusion of too many. So
Okay, well, I've got a couple questions that I want to kind of throw at you.
yeah,
Firstly, just to go back to one of the very first things you said, I think when you say that you got into this because of your own experience with having Lyme, a lot of the people that end up in holistic health in general end up here because they get a diagnosis or someone they love gets a diagnosis,
Yeah.
or or the opposite, they're sick and nobody will give them a diagnosis. So
Yeah.
a lot of the people in this group have that experience of, yeah, this is how we land here. Um, I was curious, what kind of modalities and treatments have you tried that you have found have been successful for you, or that you're seeing have been successful for a lot of the people that you're associated with in this?
Yeah, this is a really difficult question to answer because I tried just about everything under the sun, and particularly with Lyme disease, every case is so different. I'm always a little bit hesitant to say what worked for me because then I see other people say, "Oh, that worked for him, that will work for me," and they pursue that, 100% in on that, and that modality doesn't work. And the reality of, Lyme disease as an umbrella term is it tends to be more than just infection with Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the pathogen that causes it. So almost everybody I know that has severe chronic, as we call it, or late disseminated is the more acceptable term in the medical literature if you don't want to get in trouble with anybody. Chronic Lyme tends to be sort of looked down on as a term. Late disseminated goes better. But pretty much everybody who has some sort of chronic manifestation of this disease has more than just an infection with this bacteria. And what I've found the most common sort of co-precipitators are other infections, one, two, environmental toxins, mold in their environments, chemicals, things like that, people that tend to be sensitive to those. Obviously, genetic predispositions can play a sort of role in that. But the biggest thing that I've noticed in just about every single person that I've met that has a really severe manifestation of chronic Lyme is it's been precipitated by some sort of trauma before their symptoms came. And it can be an emotional trauma, it can be a physical trauma, but something generally of some severity has happened in their life that's been left unresolved. And it can be immediately precipitating it, it can be before, and that leads to this sort of huge drop in their health. And I think that that's a really important thing that a lot of people don't get better unless they address is something about this like trauma that they've experienced. Or in some cases, I think there's also trauma. There's this concept of inherited trauma, which I think is becoming quite well accepted, and so that can play a role for some people as well. But if people don't sort of go through this list of like hierarchical needs, so a lot of people will not, practitioners will not treat people for Lyme disease unless they're dealing with mold in their environment. That's basically because the immune system is so activated by their environmental sickness that there's just, you can put them on all the antibiotics in the world and they'll never get better. So that has to be treated. And a lot of people, the trauma, the emotional side of things, the mental side, in a lot of cases as well, the spiritual side has to be looked at as well. Without that being healed, you're going to have no success against the bacteria. And slowly you whittle away at these other things until you get to a point where you can treat the actual bacteria itself. And again, that's not just limited to those. There can be co-infection, there can be opportunistic infections. Pretty much all of us carry microbes in us that can be pathogenic under the right conditions, and our immune systems keep them in check. And if something happens to our immune system that it gets extremely dysregulated, they can come back out. You can think of people that have any number of herpes simplex viruses that when they get stressed, it comes out. That's a really standard thing. That happens in a lot of other ways as well. So that's what I've found for most people. So for me, I mean, I had a combination of these things. I pursued everything. I had really bad neurological symptoms, so I pursued a lot of neurological treatments. I pursued antibiotic therapies. I did herbal therapies. I did energy medicine. I did IV therapies. Everything sort of came together. And I think bit by bit, different things got healed. And eventually the pieces came together in a way that my body started putting itself back together. My immune system came back online and started to see a little bit of success of, getting my life back together.
So everybody in this group works with energetic kinesiology in one way or another. And one of the core tenets of that really is like I'm often telling people, I don't really care about your diagnosis. Because to me, I'm not helping you really deal with this particular virus or this bacteria. I'm looking at where is the stress in your body that has allowed this to exist. So we're always looking at that whole picture, right? The mold in the environment, the relationship stress, the whatever that has created the conditions to allow this to exist. And that kind of what you were just saying, I know when you had first sent me to your website and I was reading some of the research, one of the things I was really noticing was that it seems like, and that was a while ago, so I might, if I say it wrong, please correct me, but it seemed like there were a lot of people that you were testing where they were testing positive for some of those pathogens, but they were not showing symptoms. And so I'm always curious, like what makes one person really resilient and resistance to have resistance to this pathogen and somebody else it wrecks their life. And how do we build that resilience, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean that's a really good observation. There's sort of a saying in the Lyme disease medical community that if you don't have symptoms, don't go looking for it. Because my opinion, and I don't say this to scare people, is that there is a lot more people infected with Borrelia the pathogen than there are people with Lyme disease by a huge number.
yeah.
And
We were
so there
actually talking
is,
about that.
oh
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there is something that people, as I said, get sick or don't get sick. And again, the biggest thing that I've noticed is that people usually, I think, like, so for myself, I didn't have a distinct tick bite and then started getting sick. In my case, there was sort of an accumulation of traumatic things. And eventually one day I was very sick and it happened almost, in an instant. It's like everything just kind of drained out. And the more people I talked to, that was the common thread is there was some sort of trauma that had preceded this. And so I think that one of the um, things that sort of sets who's going to get sick and who doesn't get sick apart is a, what their environment is like, physically, and B, what their sort of like emotional environment has been like. Have they experienced traumas in their life? Have they been able to resolve those traumas? Are they in environments that are suppressing their immune system? There are a lot of theories out there about what makes pathogens more pathogenic or not inside a person, and also, what gives us sort of more stronger immune systems or weaker immune systems. And I think those things come together. And that's sort of what I have found is opportunistic, like you could probably consider Borrelia somewhat of an opportunistic pathogen. I think a lot of us have it. It's sort of dormant. I know that I have it, in me now. It's not been eradicated. I don't have flare-ups very frequently because I think I have resolved a lot of the things that put me in a susceptible space. But I notice if I go through stressful periods, I have emotional stresses, I go through, difficult times, I feel these things start to like bubble up. And I've developed a lot of tools that help me regulate myself, put them back, down, get some control over it and that sort of thing. So I think that we could look at people we could take a research approach and we could look at people and we could try to identify markers. And we do at the university. We'd look for, biochemical markers of what, separates the people that get sick from those who don't. That's actually one of the studies we have ongoing. In my opinion, you won't find anything because it's not in the traditional markers. It's in these other areas. And I think that's one of the challenges of working within a strict, sort of medical or research system is we don't really have the tools, I think, currently to measure a lot of the things that are wrong with us. Again, very limited markers. If you're in, a very progressive research institute, you might be able to expand that. But again, I'm not sure that the answer is in of C, White House, all that sort of thing. You may there, but my opinion is that it goes beyond that. I think we're a little bit away from the tools to really figure out what pieces are. But there are sort of groups on the sort of forefront of this science that I think are identifying these things in clinics. And again, I think it's sort of what some people would consider intangibles. Where are people at emotionally, spiritually? What kind of traumas have they resolved? That sort of thing. But I think we're a ways away from sort of mainstream medical literature adopting those understandings.
Several of us in this group were involved in a conference that happened last spring that was talking about trauma and unwinding trauma. And one of the things that I was talking about was really the way that it affects the autoimmune system and how we see a lot of autoimmune issues in the thymus and the thyroid, especially that seem to be from emotional stress, emotional trauma. And it seems like the medical system is starting to kind of realize that there's a correlation, but it's been a hard go to get that. Um, but one of the things, and I don't know actually if this is true with Lyme disease, do more women end up with Lyme disease infections than men? When we talk about autoimmune issues, it is a huge disproportionate thing. There's a lot more women with autoimmune issues, and it's because of the emotional stress. But I don't know if that's true for Lyme.
Yeah, no, it is true for Lyme as well. Yeah.
Okay.
And I've asked about this at various clinics I've been to, and the answers have ranged from something like that to men are just unwilling to admit that they're sick, which I don't think is the case. I do think disproportionately it seems to affect women in a way that they come into these chronic symptoms and seek help. Sorry. Um, I don't know if the actual distribution of sick men versus sick women is 50-50 or skewed in one direction, but when you do end up in dedicated Lyme disease clinics, I would say you probably see 60, 65, maybe even 70% women as patients, has been my experience in those places.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna stop hogging the microphone here and we can open this up. And if anybody has any questions or thoughts or anything on this subject.
Um, I do. I've had Lyme disease 3 times. My kids have each had it twice, and my husband and my kids would go down to the woods a lot. There's a creek nearby, and they both got Lyme disease, and he didn't. And what happened was months later, like I don't like 8 months, 10 months later, so he was on chemotherapy and he went off of chemotherapy to take a break from it, which we'd all agreed to do. And within 24 hours, he had full-blown Lyme disease symptoms, which again, I know a bit about it. And I spent 9 days in bed the first time I had it, not knowing what the earth was going on. But anyway, and we got muscle tested. Yes, yes. I asked the doctors to do a test and they did, but it was negative. But then I learned when you're on steroids or antibiotics, it can be a false negative. But my point is the fact that um, he, I think what happened is the chemo was so overwhelming to the body that the Lyme was there but couldn't be expressed at all. Or actually, no, the body couldn't fight it at all. So it was the body suddenly fighting the Lyme disease,
Yeah.
and the Lyme got angry, and then you have all these. I mean, he was sick as a dog, and I started giving him supplements right away. But I'm just wondering if you've experienced that other things can, like if somebody thinks maybe they have Lyme or whatever, they get a test done and they have, say, a virus, and they get the virus taken care of, then the Lyme symptoms come out or whatever.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on that. I mean, the first one is that steroids are like heavily contraindicated in Lyme disease for that exact reason. Is if you're on steroids, your immune system is depressed. And then what happens is you have this opportunity for Lyme disease to start to, kind of come out of, if it's been kept in check, to come out of that, start to, become problematic. And I think what happens then is when you stop the steroids, for the most part, the symptoms you experience with Lyme disease are due to your body's reaction to it in a lot of ways. So there's two things that happen. So probably what happened is when the steroids were stopped, the body started eating it, as you said, and that means a lot of the symptoms started to appear. But the other thing that happens that's like quite specific to Lyme disease and one other spirochete pathogen, syphilis, is something that's dubbed the Jarisch-Herxheimer reaction, which is basically a reaction as you start to kill Lyme disease, it becomes very, very painful. And basically, what happens is in the membrane of Lyme disease is something called endotoxin A. As you kill the spirochetes, they burst apart and that liberates endotoxin. Endotoxin then goes on, and pretty much every membrane in your body that it touches, it disrupts and it causes all sorts of damage. So there's this. I kind of likened Lyme disease treatment to chemo earlier because a lot of times what happens, and I experienced this to an extreme when I first started treating because I was so sick. The first time I took an antibiotic, I felt nothing. And then in about 2 hours, it was like every symptom I had from Lyme disease was 100,000 times worse. It was unbearable. I used to like have a panic attack and a breakdown every time I had to take a new antibiotic because it was so severe. And basically, what's happening is as you're killing these bacteria, if you kind of think of like as they're sort of dormant in you, you have like a baseline toxicity of 100 as an arbitrary unit. There's this endotoxin is mostly inside the bacteria. It is causing problems, your immune system. You kill it, and that baseline moves up to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. And suddenly your body is being racked by these sort of like horrible, horrible toxins. And you're very, very sick. I felt like I was burning from the inside out. And if you don't have the right sort of things on board to help deal with that, a lot of like anti-inflammatories, things can kind of um, bind to these toxins so that your body can get rid of them, then you have these very, very extreme reactions. And I would suspect what happened was twofold. One, the immune reaction started coming in. So there was, side effects there. Your husband was feeling that. And then as the immune system started to kill Borrelia for the first time, it was liberating these toxins. They were having the equivalent of a Jarisch-Herxheimer reaction, and they felt very, very sick because of that. And then the body has to adapt to that. The liver has to pump out a bunch of glutathione to try and clean up these endotoxins. You have to basically capture and excrete them. It's a long, very, very painful process. And that's what I would interpret from that. And that would be, something that happens in other situations as well. So not just with chemotherapy, but because of the corticosteroids, that would be my guess of what was happening.
Well, the steroids came later. In other words, there was
Okay.
the the um the Lyme disease, and then by the end of the week, um, well, within a week or so, he ended up with being diagnosed as a brain cancer. When we had gotten rid of all the lung and bone cancer,
Mm,
something showed up there. And I read years ago that if you have multiple, or if you have lots of Lyme in your brain, it can produce brain cancer.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
because everything, he had 20 spots in his lungs that were all gone. We did chemotherapy, and I really don't know how much that worked, but that's when I got exposed to kinesiology and made a huge difference. Um, so the steroids came later, but it was after that started that I took the test.
Hmm.
And I'm working with these doctors, and it was a nightmare. They don't
Yeah,
want to believe a
absolutely.
word I say,
No,
and
of
yet
course not.
I know what was going on. But anyway, so yeah, the medical world has a long way to go. I have a question about what you said. These endotoxins, are the endotoxins inside the spirochetes?
I believe they're membrane bound, so they're part of like the outer shell of the bacteria. So they're kind of kept in the membrane there, and then as when you kill the bacteria, the membrane comes apart, and things that are membrane bound become sort of accessible to your body.
But that the like spirochetes are sort of collecting all these different toxins.
Well, it's part of them. It's toxic to us.
Oh, it's
It's part of what makes up their outer coat, if you think about it that way.
oh, it's part of them. Okay,
Yeah,
that's something that's interesting. I never heard that before. I have one more question. I don't want to
yeah,
hog the time here, but um, I we have a cat. We had to put it down after about 18 years, and that cat had a million ticks in his life, and
yeah.
he never got sick. And I live in a very heavy tick area here in Pennsylvania, and I know dogs that have gotten it and died from it. And I wonder if anybody has ever studied why cats may be resilient to it.
I don't know of any research looking at it. I do know that cats can get it. I know of cats that have. I
Oh,
don't think it's the same, proportion that dogs and humans. So there's sort of a hierarchy. Humans tend to get it more. Dogs have a stronger immune response that means they get exposed to ticks more. They get less manifestations of Lyme disease, and then cats another tier less than that. So I would imagine it has to do with the strength of the immune response to it. And I have like read some, I guess, conversations about which branch of the immune system is better with dealing with sort of like acute infections, whether it be like T helper cell based or B cell based, like your antibodies versus your, cytotoxic killers, that sort of thing. And
mhm.
and so if there was a really big difference, I mean, my initial thought would just be that um, cats might have a much stronger initial, cytotoxic T cell response to it, so they get less of like an established infection. Because I think with dogs, at least, there is evidence of very strong initial immune responses following tick bites that we don't tend to see in humans. Very quick, very strong. So you don't get as much like as high of an infection rate. And I don't know of any research looking at cats, but my guess would be it's something like that. I don't think they have sort of a necessarily like specific built-in immunity. They might just have a sort of stronger immune system response to that sort of pathogen.
Well, and that makes sense because, I've heard it said that, if you have a strong immune system, you'll never get cancer. So if you get cancer, there's a weak. So I'm sure that's a lot to do with a lot of things. So
Yeah, there's a really
thank you.
interesting study on there's some clinics that use some sort of attenuated virus that they causes a very high Th1 response. And they found that it's like sort of has like a universally blanketing effect on treating cancers for that exact reason, as it just kills like
Hmm.
aberrant cells. So I think there's a lot to that. And there's also been some studies that look at, I would say, people in, I'm going to call them North American environments. It's beyond that, but some environments that are more challenging, maybe to our, maybe containing more toxins, that sort of thing. We
Mhm.
tend to have depressed Th1 responses. Or I can't remember. Sorry, it could be Th2. I would have to go back and check. But either way, there's a depressed response there, and there's some theories that that might be leading to increases in cancer rates and difficulties with dealing with infections and that sort of things.
Okay, thank you.
I kind of have a question along the same line, but different. Is there any research into preventative supplements or anything like that? I mean, given what you said about the traumas and things stacking in a body and someone's environment and their inner environment, it would probably be different. But for example, our dog, we buy her a supplement every spring and she gets one a month. And apparently, this thing, if she does get bitten by a tick or some other bug, it prevents her from contracting some of these
Yeah.
conditions. And I'm wondering if there's something like that for humans, or would it even work? Because then
Yeah.
if you live in an area that is has a lot of ticks and Lyme, you could take one, or I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a couple things. I mean, so if we're looking at just whether, are there supplements that, make you more repellent to ticks? I've heard anecdotal theories on it. I don't know how many of them hold up. There is evidence that certain blood types are more or less attractive to ticks, but the literature is sort of split on it. There was one study that said AB was more uh, attractive to ticks, and then another study came out and said AB was less attractive to ticks. But in groups that have been looked at, there has been significant differences in sort of which blood types are more attractive. I have, sorry, I guess then to move from that, there are now people that are looking more into uh, herbal remedies for treating Lyme disease and looking at the efficacy of those in vitro in the ways that we would look at antibiotic therapies. If we take a culture of Borrelia and we add X concentration of antibiotic therapy, does it prevent growth? Does it kill the organism? What happens, 6 weeks later? Does it regrow? That sort of thing. That's, how we one of the ways that we start looking at the efficacy of antibiotic treatments. And people have started doing that with herbal remedies and find that at least in vitro, they're comparable to a lot of the antibiotic therapies. And that's coming out of some like major universities like Johns Hopkins. So it's not kind of really fringe work. It's becoming quite established, and not just for Lyme disease, for things like Babesia, which is carried by ticks as well. There's a lot of work that shows like artemisinin is actually probably a better option than a lot of like the chloroquine based drugs that can be very, very detrimental as well. And so, kind of on that theme, there's a lot of anecdotal, I don't want to call it anecdotal, but like evidence coming out of clinics, not out of, scientific research papers, of herbals that people take that have a better chance of, preventing, if you do get bit by a tick, that it's going to establish an infection with you, because there's things that have to happen. It's not like you get bit by a tick and then you have Lyme disease. The tick has to carry Borrelia. The Borrelia has to migrate out of the tick into the host immune system. The host immune system has to fail to control it. It has to establish that sort of thing. So there's evidence of people taking certain supplements or herbal remedies that can make that difficult, or that process more likely to, or let's say less likely to establish. And one of the ones that I know of and I use is something called Cistus incanis, which is a plant from, I think, like Sardinia or something like that. It grows wild there, and it has really, really strong antiviral properties. It's been shown to be, again, in like the medical literature, it's been shown to be effective in preventing HIV from, I guess, sort of becoming, I don't know what the right word for it is, but sort of turning into an actual, you have the virus HIV, and then you kind of move into AIDS. It kind of can repress that sort of thing. That's been shown with this particular herbal. When I was very sick, I drank it every day, and that's one of the sort of main protocols for some practitioners, is to use the Cistus incanis. And I have heard, again, I can't verify this or not, that it's very good at repelling ticks as well. And then if you do get bit, the likelihood of established infection is much, much lower, which I wouldn't be surprised about. And there are other sort of, herbal therapies as well that kind of track along that. But in terms of supplements, there are also protocols that people use. And one of them is, I think, even Richard Horowitz, Dr. Horowitz, who's like very, very strict into the sort of like Western medicine style. He has a list of supplements that he recommends for Lyme patients. And I think that there's a number of things in there that are immune system boosting, in terms of like the actual immune pathways that are more specific to Lyme disease. And those are things that I think, like, if I were to make a recommendation, which I'm definitely not, would be some of those. And I'm trying to think of what some of the main ones were, but he has a website with them on there as well. And I think one of them is sulforaphane, which is you can get from like broccoli sprouts, microgreens, that sort of thing, very high concentrations. I know a lot of them are around the glutathione pathway. So glutathione itself, liposomal, is the only way to do that. Alpha lipoic acid for recycling glutathione, N-acetylcysteine as a precursor to it. I'm trying to think of what else is in there. There's a couple other ones. But again, just sort of so that if you do get bit by a tick and it does have bacteria, and that bacteria is then transmitted to you, that your body has the best chance to prevent that from becoming an established infection. And I think there's a lot of value to that, because we're not going to catch every tick that bites us. And if you're living in a tick endemic area, which, if you have homes in the United States or Canada, particularly in the sort of like Northeast, you're likely to encounter ticks. And if you can't, physically prevent them from biting you, you want your best chance for your immune system to prevent a chronic infection.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that, because my first case of Lyme disease, again, I was 9 days in bed until went to the doctor finally, and I had a round pink spot, not a bullseye. And he said, "Oh, tests aren't reliable. It's Lyme." Put me on antibiotics. And it got me out of bed and alive again. but it didn't get rid of all the problems. I had a lot of stomach upset and so on. And it wasn't a year later that I ended up at my wellness center with applied kinesiology and found they said, "Oh, you still have Lyme disease." And my daughter was the same thing. She had antibiotics, the same right around the same time. She had antibiotics and she still had Lyme disease. And so I thought antibiotics don't do the job 100%. So why bother going that direction? And I think so all the other cases that we had, which is my son's two cases, my daughter's other, and then another one, two more for me, we've gotten rid of them all with herbs through muscle testing.
Yeah.
So I absolutely believe, and I don't worry about Lyme as much, even though it's awful to go through it. But because if you get it quickly, which we do, but they absolutely work. I mean, I have no symptoms. I have Lyme 3 times
Mhm.
and no symptoms. So
Yeah. I think with antibiotics, there is also a misunderstanding in the medical community of what the actual appropriate course of antibiotics is, if it's going to work. Um, so there's different guidelines. The IDSA, Infectious Disease Society of America, says 14 days. Well, the first they say that a single bolus dose of one day, they call it like a prophylactic dose, is going to prevent Lyme disease. It won't. There was the study done on that showed that that dose worked to prevent the formation of a bullseye rash, provided that it was given within 36 hours of initial tick attachment, which nobody knows. And then the only metric for a cure in that was, did the erythema migrans, which is the bullseye rash, disappear? That's like saying, if you get a virus and I give you Advil and your headache goes away, that I made you better. I didn't. Um, so they've expanded that a little bit and they say 14 days will knock it out. Well, the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society, which I would consider more of a patient-centric group rather than an insurance-centric group, they publish guidelines that say 4 to 6 weeks minimum of doxycycline or amoxicillin is needed to prevent chronic Lyme disease. So there's a misuse of antibiotics to begin with in that. And then the other side of that is antibiotics have a lot of different side effects. So your commensal flora is obviously plays a big part in immunity, and you have a tendency to wipe those out. So I'm pro antibiotics, and I'm also pro herbals, and I'm pro everything that is helping people. I think that I see a lot of people with a lot of really good success with herbal remedies like you're describing, and I think that's great. And I see other people with a lot of success with antibiotics. I think that's great. I think every person is a little bit different. But one of the things that I do know for absolute certain is that the antibiotic guidelines are often misused. And then people get a false sense of security. They think, oh, I've been cured. Well, what's probably happened with Lyme disease is when we do treat it with antibiotics, especially in the laboratory, we kill most of it. We can't even see it in culture anymore, but you leave that culture in the incubator and you have a resurgence of Lyme disease in a couple of weeks, months. And basically what happens is Lyme disease is or the Borrelia is a unique organism. It can form different forms. There's something called round bodies or persister forms. You treat it with antibiotics, it kills a lot of them. The rest of them go into these basically metabolically inert tiny little balls that can't be killed traditionally by antibiotics. You think you've eradicated the issue. As soon as you stop the antibiotic therapy, they come back out. That's just in a test tube. Then you put that inside a person, and there's a lot more that can happen. They can sequester into tissues. People with parasites, it's been shown that they can sequester into parasites and are essentially protected by these like intestinal parasites, things like that. Um, they can be immunosuppressive, so you may get rid of most of them, and then you stop the antibiotics. You think your immune system will knock it down, but they've sort of suppressed your immune system or evaded that response. So it's something that yeah, I think in my opinion, again, this is just my opinion, uh, multi-system approaches help here. Just antibiotics and again, I'm mostly talking about chronically ill people sort of as a segue from the acutely ill that we're talking about. In chronically ill people, you need sort of multiple ways to attack it. And that's where people, I think, see the most success. But I have seen people get completely better with herbal remedies. And now when I have a flare up, I don't go for antibiotics. I go for got my my cohort of supplements and herbals that do the trick for me, um, and tend to work. But yeah, it's super complicated and just a challenge to deal with.
There's a few questions in the chat. A lot of them are from me. If you don't mind checking quickly before we're
Yeah, sure.
wrapping
Yeah,
up.
let me open that up. Okay. Is it more likely for someone who is taking corticosteroids to regulate another condition to contract Lyme or they have more severe symptoms? I would say it's more likely for someone on corticosteroids to get sort of an established infection of Lyme disease, and their symptoms would not be more severe because the immune system is dampened and a lot of the symptoms come from that. So a lot of people on corticosteroids think they're getting better. That's one of the problems with mistaking Lyme disease for autoimmune diseases. They get treated initially with corticosteroids. The person says, "Oh my God, this is great. I'm feeling better." What's actually happening is their symptoms are being depressed, and because their immune system is also depressed, the Lyme disease bacteria is multiplying. And then as soon as the immune system comes back on, or the damage from the pathogen replicating becomes larger, they get very, very sick. Corticosteroids are about the last thing you want to do for somebody with Lyme disease, and that's exactly the reason for that. The herb, yeah. So Cistus incanus is the name of the herb, and yeah, from Lisa, Cistus tea. That's you can. That's how I take it as a tea. There's a method for how to do it. Sort of the main champion of this is a guy named Dr. Diedrich Klinghardt, who's a really interesting individual. I'm sure everybody has heard of him before, but some of his, in my opinion, he's one of the big champions of Lyme disease, and he mostly uses herbals and energy medicine, and he has a tendency to collect patients that don't get better in any other way and find answers for them, even if those answers tend to feel a little bit out there to some people. Um, Does the inert bacteria hang out in a specific part of the body, like we see with shingles, for instance? Yeah, absolutely. So different. Again, so to sort of preface this question, Borrelia is caused by a bacteria. Borrelia. Lyme disease is caused by a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi. It's actually a group of bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi sensu latu, which means group. Depending on where you are, different species of this group are what's giving you Lyme disease. In North America, it's generally Borrelia burgdorferi sensu strictu. But there are different strains of a single species. Probably, I think we've probably identified 20, 30 just for Borrelia burgdorferi sensu stricto. And what we found is different strains have different tropism, which is a likeness to different parts of the body. So if you were just to break it up by species, you would see that in North America, we tend to have tropism for neurological tissue, for cardiac tissue. In Europe, where Afzelii and Grynnii are the main culprits, we have tropism for connective tissue. So you have different symptoms. You have arthritic symptoms in Europe. In North America, we have neurological symptoms. We have arthritic symptoms as well. We have cardiac. We have, in a lot of cases, more severe. So different Borrelia species and strains will hang out in different tissues. And because of that, people will need different interventions because not all antibiotics, not all therapies can reach the same tissues. And you can generally tell what the tropism is based on the symptoms. I had a lot of neurological symptoms. The Borrelia that I was experiencing tended to be in my neurological tissues and then spread, kind of everywhere else. If somebody has really arthritic symptoms, it's probably connective tissue. Somebody has cardiac symptoms, it's probably in cardiac tissue. It being there causes local inflammation to that. That local inflammation is what causes a lot of the symptoms. So definitely, if it's inert, it's still probably in those tissues more than anywhere else.
That's going to contribute to the difficulty in diagnosing because the symptoms look so different depending
Yeah,
on which strain. Gotcha.
yeah, and each
Okay,
person's experience with it.
right. We are coming near the end. I don't want to take advantage of your good nature and go late here. I am
No problem.
wondering, I would be really curious if you have anything to say about alpha-gal as something that I'm running into more and more with clients lately, with varying
Yeah.
degrees of success with treatment.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of answers for the treatment of alpha gal. I mean, alpha gal is not an infectious pathogen. Alpha gal is essentially an immune response. So what happens with alpha gal is alpha galactosidase is a sugar that's in meats, and there's a component of a particular species of tick called Amblyomma americanum is the lone star tick, and related other Amblyomma species, as far as I know, can carry this as well. So they have this alpha galactosidase sugar in their saliva. So when they bite somebody, that person has an immune response to the bite, and it sees alpha galactosidase and it develops antibodies towards that. And then, you know, that person then eats meat, and the body sees alpha galactosidase again. And it says, "Oh, the tick is back, or this problem is back," and it has this immune response to it. And that's what's making people sick, is their body is seeing a sugar that they've seen their whole life in meats and stuff, but suddenly they saw it in what I would consider a traumatic circumstance or potentially infectious circumstance. So the body created an immune response to it, and then it sees it again and has these increasing in severity immune responses over and over again. And that's why people have these tend to be increasing responses to when they eat meat or they're exposed to things with meat products. So the approach to treating alpha galactosidase is different than what I would be dealing with pathogens. You're not trying to kill a pathogen. I think you're trying to reprogram the immune system to say, hey, this isn't what you think it is. So it's more akin to like autoimmunity, where your body starts inappropriately recognizing something as problematic when it's not. But that's been precipitated by seeing it in the context of an infectious moment with a tick bite.
Gotcha. I thought that there was some kind of specific bacteria or pathogen that was creating this specific response, but that's
No,
interesting.
it's tick
Okay,
saliva. Yeah, yeah.
cool. Okay. What was that?
Why take the question on your phone?
Oh, you sent me a question.
Yes.
Okay, wait. We've been texted a question from inside the room. Okay, wait. Okay. Um, does it have to be ticks necessarily? Because is this pathogen showing up in mosquitoes and can it be passed down
Yeah,
genetically?
yeah. This is a fun one. This is a controversial but important question. So to preface this, in the literature, there are instances of people detecting Lyme disease in mosquitoes through batch testing, through PCR-based techniques. And my caveat to that is that PCR is, especially in laboratories, research-based laboratories, can be very subject to false positive results. So if I'm a laboratory that tests for Borrelia routinely and I find it, I'm creating in my lab a lot of copies of this that they can then slip into other experiments and show up. So I know that it has been published that it's been found in mosquitoes. I don't know if it's really in mosquitoes. I can't say that. I have some wariness of it. The other side to that is, in order for Borrelia to become infectious in a host, there's a process that has to happen. When it's in ticks, it has some outer surface proteins that keep it anchored to the gut. And then as the tick starts feeding, Borrelia literally changes its protein expression so that it can become, um, let's say, like pathogenic. So it can start moving out of the tick into the human. So this process takes hours. And if you think of the bite of mosquitoes and other biting insects, they tend to be pretty transient. So even if they had it, I don't know that they're being um, that they're competent vectors of it. So even within ticks, there are species of ticks that can carry Borrelia, and they're not competent vectors of it, which means they can bite somebody and they don't transmit the bacteria. There's a species of tick that has something in their saliva that kills it when it tries to transmit. So even if it is in mosquitoes, biting flies, which I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that it is, and my company, we have collected biting flies and we've tested them and we've never found it. That's not to say it's not there. We haven't seen it. The other thing is you need a reservoir species for these insects to pick it up from. So when ticks acquire Borrelia, they do it from, let's say, white-footed mice that have Borrelia. They feed on that in a life stage, and the next life stage, they have Borrelia they can pass on. So, in this sort of theory, mosquitoes would have to feed on something and then feed on something else. And they would have to have the Borrelia go through these protein coat changes to become infectious, that sort of thing. So I don't know that even if it's in there, that that's a viable vector for it. I'm not ruling it out, but I don't know that it's the case. But the complication to this is I think there are more people with Lyme disease or with Borrelia in them than there are ticks biting people, and in areas where ticks are not biting people. So, what are the other routes of transmission? We do know that it can be passed from mother to child. That's been shown. That's a possibility. If you are a woman with Lyme disease and you get pregnant, it's something that you have to be aware of. And there are, I think, some protocols that are safer than others for trying to deal with that, and you have to make a judgment call. There are a lot of people that question if Lyme disease is sexually transmitted, and the evidence for that was that it's been found in seminal fluids, it's been found in secretions. That doesn't again mean that it's transmissible that way. It's also, sort of considered somewhat genetically related to other spirochetes like syphilis, which are sexually transmissible. I don't know if that is a viable route either. When you speak to people in the medical community that see lots of patients, they say, no, I don't think so, because I would see more of my patients with partners that are sick. If you talk to some people that have sick partners, they say, yes, it is. So anecdotally, it's not very clear. But um, my sort of guess about this is that there is a transmission route beyond just ticks, because I don't think we can account for the amount of Lyme disease that we see based off of tick bites, and we can't see the amount of people getting sick with Lyme disease outside of tick endemic areas. Um, and again, another caveat to that is Lyme disease is somewhat of an umbrella term. So whether everybody who is diagnosed with Lyme disease actually has infection with Borrelia burgdorferi or something related, or just something similar, I don't know. But I do think there is more Lyme disease than there are people being bit by ticks. So there must be something else going on. I just don't know exactly what it is.
Thank you. Okay, do we have any last questions, comments, thoughts for Justin? Okay. Going once, going twice. All
Thank
right.
you.
No, no
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was scribbling furiously at various points there, making some notes, and have some ideas of other things that I want to research and look at now.
Yeah,
So thank you for taking the time to chat with
no
us this
problem.
evening.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah, yeah. What's your question?
Is there one test that is more accurate than another test? Because you hear so many different stories.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and probably a good thing to end on as well. Yeah, so the traditional two-tier serology is bad. I'll just say that. If you get a negative from that, you should ignore it and pursue other testing. I'm not going to talk about energy testing. You all would know more about that than me. But in terms of laboratory testing, there's a test called the ELISpot. It's a T cell based test. It's my favorite test for Lyme disease for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't rely on traditional serology, which is flawed. Two, T cell activity is only high when the pathogen is present for about 4 to 6 weeks after that as well. So it can give you an idea of ongoing infection. So the ELISpot test is often run out of a lab in Germany called Armin Labs. And for people that are wondering if I'm sick and Lyme disease is the problem, I say ELISpots are the way to go. Um, there is some controversy around the ELISpot. And to be honest, it's, in my opinion, sort of garbage. It doesn't have medical or scientific merit. It's sort of an attack campaign against the people that did the work. And they went into their lab and found they weren't compliant in some obscure protocol and use that to try to invalidate the test. So if you research it, you may come across something like that, and I would take it with a grain of salt. But it's well used with practitioners and also as a metric for determining if their treatments are working, because you could do an antibiotic therapy and the LE spot, response goes down. That means your therapy is working, or it goes up, your therapy is not working. Um, the other option are more traditional serology routes that rely on antibodies. And so they're similar to the two-tiered serology, but with less stringent reporting measures. So the two-tier serology relies on an ELISA, which has to be positive to get to a Western blot that will look for 10 antigens, and 5 of them have to be positive. So you could have a positive ELISA and then 4 positives out of 10 for a Western blot, and they would say you don't have Lyme disease, which is an absolutely absurd thing to do. So there are places like IGeneX in California, and Armin Labs does these as well, that can tell you with better confidence if your body has ever seen Lyme disease antigens before. So those are my two go-tos for people, and those are like the more traditionally established. There's a lot of new sort of tests coming out that I think will probably show merit, but I wouldn't endorse them until they've had, more time to actually go through the ringer of people using them, because things can look good in a laboratory setting and then not work in a practical setting. So the two best options, in my opinion, for laboratory testing for Lyme disease are Armin Labs and IGeneX, and the LE spot, and then either the Western blots, traditional ELISAs, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
All right. So, thank you so much again for spending some time
No
with us this
problem.
evening.
Yeah, appreciate
We're
it.
going to share this recording with the other people who are, it's not going to go publicly on YouTube,
Okay.
but like the
Yeah,
people that are part of our little community here,
sure.
that can't make it to an evening event. And if people are curious about learning more about Justin's work or want to reach out, his websites were in the study hall chat and Discord. I had already listed them before. Justin, any other way that people should get a hold of you, or should they just not
Oh, no,
get a
no,
hold
people
of
can
you?
get a hold of me. Yeah. No, I mean, we have a contact form on our website, or I'm happy to share my email as well if anybody wants to contact me directly. I have less time now than I used to, but I do try to get back to people, particularly about, urgent questions. So that would be the best routes, either through the contact form on the website or through my email.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm going to turn off the recording.